There is a house in Placentia, California that holds a secret. It sits on a quiet street in Orange County, the kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturdays, where everybody knows everybody, and where nothing bad is supposed to happen. The car in the driveway hasn't moved in weeks. The lights inside go dark every night at the same time they always did. But the man who lived there, the man who parked that car, who turned off those lights, he is gone, and nobody can explain where he went. His name was Bob Harrod. He was 81 years old. He had money, and he had just fallen in love for the second time in his life, with the same woman he had first loved 60 years ago. He had a wedding ring on his finger, a ticket booked, and a reason, for the first time in years, to feel happy about the future. And then, just days before the woman he loved was supposed to walk through his front door, Bob Harrod was gone. No body, no blood, no signs of a fight, no note. His car was in the driveway. His glasses were on the table. His house keys were hanging on the hook by the door. The only thing missing from that house was Bob himself. What happened in Placentia in 2009 is not a simple missing person case. It is a story about love found twice, about family loyalty tested by money, and about the scary truth that the people we trust the most are sometimes the ones we should be most afraid of. This is the story of Bob Harrod, and the case that has never been solved. To understand what happened to Bob Harrod, you have to understand who Bob Harrod was, not the rich man, not the missing person, the human being. Bob had spent most of his life building something real in Southern California. He was a practical man, a hard worker, the kind of man who understood that financial security doesn't come from luck, it comes from showing up every single day. Over his lifetime, he had built an estate worth around $5 million, a home in Placentia, savings, smart investments, the quiet result of decades of careful decisions. He had been married for over 50 years. To those who knew him, that marriage had been the center of everything. When his wife passed away, something inside Bob changed. The foundation he had built his whole life on was suddenly gone. He was an 81-year-old widower, alone in a big house in Orange County, surrounded by everything he had built but deeply, quietly lonely. His 3 adult daughters were part of his life. They checked in. They helped with things. They looked, from the outside, like a family dealing with loss together. But loss has a way of changing people, and what happened next would change everything. Her name was Fontel, and if there is one bright moment in Bob Harrod's story, one moment of warmth before everything goes dark, it is the moment he found her again. Fontel had been Bob's first love. They had met when they were both very young, and what they had felt for each other was real. The kind of real that doesn't fully go away even after 60 years. Life had pulled them in different directions. Both had married other people. Both had lived full lives. 6 decades went by. And then, somewhere in the quiet sadness after losing his wife, Bob found her again. 6 decades after they had said goodbye, Bob Harrod and Fontel found each other. They talked. They remembered. And the feeling that had been there 60 years ago, it was still there. They got married. At 81 years old, Bob became a husband again. Fontel was living in another state at the time, but the plan was simple. She would move to the house in Placentia. She would bring life back to those quiet rooms. She was coming. She had a moving date. She had her bags packed. She was on her way. Bob had things to take care of before she arrived. He was getting the house ready. Everyone who saw him in those final days described a man who seemed lighter than he had been in years, a man who had something to look forward to again. He would never see Fontel again. Placentia, California in 2009 was a calm, middle-class suburb, the kind of town that almost never made the news. Orange County had a reputation for clean streets, high property values, and a feeling that certain kinds of trouble simply did not happen here. It was, by every measure you could see, a safe place to grow old. Bob Harrod vanished from that safe place without any explanation that anyone could see. What we know is this: in the days right before Fontel was supposed to arrive, Bob was still active. He was making phone calls. People saw him. He was there. And then he wasn't. When people realized he was missing, investigators checked the house in Placentia. What they found gave them no answers, only more questions. His car was parked in the driveway, cold. The doors were locked. Inside, his glasses were sitting on a table, waiting for a face that wasn't there. His keys were present. His personal belongings were untouched. There were no signs of a break-in, no signs of a fight, no blood, nothing broken, nothing out of place. What the house looked like was the home of someone who had simply stepped outside for a moment and never came back, except that moment had stretched into days. The Orange County Sheriff's Department opened an investigation. For a man of Bob's age, the first concern was medical. Maybe he fell, maybe he had a health episode and wandered off. But as investigators dug deeper and started talking to the people in Bob's life, the picture that came into focus was much more complicated. In any case, involving a missing person with real money, one of the first things investigators do is follow the money. Not because having money automatically means something criminal happened, but because money has a way of pointing toward motive. Bob Harrod's estate was worth around $5 million. That number matters. It matters because of what happened to that money and property in the weeks around Bob's disappearance, and it matters because of who stood to gain from it. When Bob married Fontel, he had also taken several important legal steps. A peer marriage agreement had been put together, a legal document designed, in theory, to protect his daughters by limiting what Fontel could claim from the estate. That document existed. What actually happened to it, and whether it did what it was supposed to do, became a major part of the investigation. Even more important was something else: the transfer of the title on Bob's home. In the time around the marriage and the disappearance, the official ownership documents on Bob's property had been changed. Who started that process, when it happened, and what legal steps were used to carry it out? All of that became part of what investigators looked into when they reviewed financial records. This is where the case shifts from a missing person story to something far more serious. When an elderly man with significant wealth goes missing, and when that disappearance happens at the same time that his property is being transferred to someone else's name, investigators have an obligation to look closely at every person who had something to gain financially. In Bob's case, that meant looking very closely at his 3 adult daughters. Bob Harrod's 3 adult daughters were, on the surface, grieving family members looking for a missing father. That is a real possibility, and it is one that has to be acknowledged. Losing a parent is painful, and whatever the daughters were feeling, it was real. But investigators quickly saw a major conflict of interest. The daughters were in line to inherit Bob's estate. Fontel, as Bob's wife, also had a legal right to part of that estate, a right that the peer marriage agreement might reduce, but could not completely remove, and the daughters had, by all solid accounts, been openly against the marriage from the start. The pushback against the marriage had not been quiet. Multiple people who knew the family described a period of serious tension between Bob and his daughters over his relationship with Fontel. There had been arguments. There had been pressure. Some accounts described the daughters as actively trying to get in the way of the marriage, trying to talk Bob out of it, trying to slow things down, trying to get involved in his financial decisions in ways that went beyond normal family concern. Bob, for his part, appeared to be a man who knew his own mind. He had lived 81 years. He had built a $5 million estate through his own hard work. He did not come across as a man who needed other people to make his decisions for him. And yet, in the final months of his visible life, the people around him were doing exactly that. The pre-marriage agreement was one way to control the situation. The property title transfer was another. Whether Bob signed those documents freely, with a clear understanding of what he was agreeing to, or whether he signed them under pressure, or without fully understanding them, is a question that investigators were never able to fully answer. One of the most important pieces of evidence in the Bob Harrod case is a documented confrontation, a serious argument that happened on or around the day Bob was last seen. Witnesses and investigation records show that Bob Harrod had a heated argument with at least one of his daughters, and by some accounts, with a son-in-law very close to the moment he disappeared. The exact topic of that argument has been described differently by different people, but the timing is not in dispute. The confrontation happened close enough to the disappearance that investigators could not treat it as a coincidence. In a missing person case with financial elements, an argument like this one is a critical piece of the puzzle. It tells investigators about the emotional state of the people involved. It points toward possible motive, and it raises one direct, uncomfortable question. What happened after that argument ended? Bob Harrod's daughters and son-in-law denied having anything to do with his disappearance. Those denials were recorded and have never changed. But with no body, with no clear physical evidence, and with a documented financial motive and a documented final argument on the record, investigators were left working with what law enforcement calls circumstantial evidence, that does not directly prove guilt, but paints a picture that is very difficult to ignore. Circumstantial evidence, it is important to understand, is not weak evidence. It is the type of evidence that has put hundreds of people behind bars in criminal cases across the United States. What it requires is enough of it. A large enough collection of facts that all point in the same direction. In Bob's case, those facts were beginning to pile up. We are now entering the darkest part of this investigation where family loyalty meets financial greed. If you want to help us keep the spotlight on unsolved cases like Bob's, please take 1 second right now and hit subscribe and like. It tells the algorithm that this story still matters. And it does matter. So let's keep going. The Orange County Sheriff's Department ran its investigation on 2 tracks at the same time. The first track was the physical search trying to find Bob himself, or any physical evidence that showed what had happened to him. The second track was the financial and personal investigation trying to fully understand the conflict surrounding his estate and his new marriage. On the physical track, investigators searched the property and the areas around it. No remains were found. No physical evidence of harm was found at the house. The fact that there was no physical evidence is itself significant. It suggests one of 2 things. Either Bob left on his own, which his behavior in the days before his disappearance does not support, or whoever was responsible made sure to clean up the physical record very carefully. On the financial track, the picture became much clearer. A review of financial records showed that, in the time period surrounding the disappearance, transactions had taken place involving Bob's assets. The property title transfer, which had moved ownership of the Placentia home, was looked at very carefully for whether it was legally valid. Serious questions were raised about whether Bob had the mental and legal ability to authorize those transfers at that time, and whether the documents had been signed under conditions where Bob was being manipulated. This type of manipulation, where someone uses their position of trust over an elderly person to push that person into financial decisions that benefit the manipulator, is one of the most common forms of elder abuse in America. It is also one of the hardest types of crimes to prove after the fact, especially when the victim is no longer available to speak for themselves. Whether this happened to Bob Harrod has never been proven in court, but the pattern of financial activity around his disappearance was consistent with exactly what investigators look for in these kinds of cases. Fontel arrived in California ready to start the next chapter of her life. What she found instead was a locked house, a missing husband, and a family that had closed ranks around an explanation that raised more questions than it answered. Her account of the situation is one of the most important parts of the story. As Bob's legal wife, Fontel had standing in the investigation both as a witness and as someone with a direct personal stake in the outcome. She worked fully with investigators. She gave them documents showing her communications with Bob in the days and weeks before he went missing. She described a man who was clear-headed, engaged, and genuinely looking forward to her arrival. She also described the family conflict in very specific terms. The tension between herself and Bob's daughters had not been hidden from Bob. He knew about it. He had, according to Fontel's account, expressed frustration with the pressure being put on him. He wanted to be with her. He wanted the life they had planned together. And he was, in her words, increasingly stressed by the walls being put up around that life. The legal fight that followed Bob's disappearance, the battle over the estate, the house, the marriage agreement ran at the same time as the criminal investigation. Fontel pursued her legal rights in civil court. The daughters pushed back. The outcome of that civil case added another layer of complexity to the already complicated picture of what had happened and who had gained from it. What Fontel's account does, within the larger investigation, is give motive a human face. This was not an abstract fight over numbers on a page. This was a real woman, a real marriage, a real love story, and the people who stood between Fontel and Bob had both the financial reason and the opportunity to make that man disappear. In any case like this one of the most powerful tools investigators have is a close, careful look at the statements made by the people of interest. The Harrod case never led to formal charges, and so there was never a courtroom moment where those statements were tested under cross-examination. But the statements that family members gave to investigators during the inquiry are worth examining for what they show. When investigators look at statements in a case with possible criminal elements, they look for several specific things. They look for whether the story stays the same every time it is told. They look at whether a person's emotional reactions match the content of what they are saying, and they look at whether the facts in the statement can actually be confirmed by outside evidence. In the Harrod investigation, accounts from family members are reported to have shifted in certain details across multiple interviews. Specific claims about the last time they saw Bob, the last time they spoke to him, and the nature of their conversations in the days right before he disappeared. Some of those details did not hold up consistently. Investigators flagged those inconsistencies for deeper examination. These inconsistencies do not prove guilt, but they are exactly the kind of signals that experienced investigators treat as red flags, the spots where a deeper line of questioning would be focused. In a case without a body, without hard physical evidence, the interview process often becomes the most important investigative tool available, and in Bob's case, those interviews left serious questions unanswered. The involvement of the son-in-law, his presence at or near the argument on the day of the disappearance, was also something investigators noted. In cases involving elder financial abuse and suspected foul play, it is not uncommon for a family member who married in someone with the financial stake, but without the blood connection, to play an active role in any criminal conduct. That possibility was present in the structural facts of Bob's case, even though it was never legally established. The Bob Harrod case does not stand alone. It sits inside a much larger, deeply troubling pattern that law enforcement agencies across the United States have been watching grow for years: the financial abuse of elderly people by their own family members. Financial abuse is the most common form of elder abuse in America, and the form least likely to result in anyone going to prison. The reasons for that gap between how often it happens and how rarely it is punished are straightforward. Elderly victims are often not in the best mental health, which makes them less reliable as witnesses. The abuse almost always happens behind closed doors, within families that look perfectly normal from the outside, and the legal tools used, things like power of attorney, property transfers, changes to wills, are completely legitimate instruments that only become weapons when they are used through force or manipulation. Bob Harrod was 81 years old. He had just lost his wife of 50 years. He was in a new relationship that his family opposed. He was making major financial decisions. Every single one of those factors placed him exactly in the category of people who are most vulnerable to this kind of abuse. Someone whose right to make his own choices could be taken from him by the people closest to him without leaving any obvious marks. Whether that is what happened to Bob Harrod has never been proven, but the conditions were all there, and the financial outcome, the property transfer, the contested peer marriage agreement, the legal battles over his estate, looks exactly like what that kind of abuse leaves behind. In the years since Bob Harrod disappeared from his home in Placentia, California, no final answer has been found. No body has been recovered. No charges have been filed. No one has been held legally responsible for his disappearance. The case remains open with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. That status open means investigators have not closed the file. It means that new evidence, new witnesses, new forensic tools, or new statements could still move the case forward. It means that, in the eyes of law enforcement, what happened to Bob Harrod has not been explained to their satisfaction. Cases like this one, cases involving elderly victims, family conflict, and money as a motive, are among the hardest to solve. Time works against physical evidence. Memories fade. The stories people tell harden into versions that are difficult to break open. The financial picture shifts as estates are settled and assets change hands over the years. But cold cases do get solved. They get solved because investigators stay committed. They get solved because new tools allow old evidence to tell new stories. And they get solved sometimes because someone who has been holding something back finally decides to speak up. If you have information about the disappearance of Bob Harrod, if you know something, or if you knew someone who did, the Orange County Sheriff's Department is the right place to make that call. A single tip has cracked cases that had been cold for decades. Bob Harrod was 81 years old. He was a husband again. He had a woman who loved him coming to his door. He had a car in the driveway, keys on the hook, glasses on the table, and a future being built in the next room. And then something happened to him. That something deserves an answer. The woman who loved him deserves an answer. And the truth, whatever it is, has been waiting long enough. The case of Bob Harrod is still open. Law enforcement has never stopped looking, and neither have we. Do you believe Bob's disappearance was a family matter? Or do you think he was the victim of something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read them, we pay attention, and your perspective genuinely matters to this community. If this story moved you, if you believe cases like Bob's deserve to stay in the public eye, please take 1 second right now and hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. It costs you nothing, but for us, it is everything. It tells the platform that this story matters, that Bob matters, and it helps us keep the light on cases that the world has tried to forget. Thank you for watching True Crime Story USA. We will see you in the next one.